that are easy to find. Feathers are one, and then ferns and grasses and leaves are the others. What you're looking for is something that has a wonderful negative space, so I like the one on the left. It's a little more uneven, very flat, very delicate, and still pliable. If you have very dry leaves, they're going to just be crispy and not want to help transfer or make impressions in the ink. And you want a size that's going to fit, or fill your page. Another wonderful found object stencil, threads and yarns of different variety, thicknesses and weights. We're going to use cyan and black to create our dark layer on our light layered bases that we did the other day. So I put down mostly cyan and a bit of black and try to mix it up. You can mix it evenly if you want, or you can have like a little bit of variegation and variety, which is what I tend to do. Again, I laid down a strip to define a shape on the print, and rather than covering the whole image with black. And then I place my stencil, hopefully in an interesting way, on the black ink, and then look through my stack of light impressions and pick one that I think will work. So what you're thinking about here is the black is going to cover up most of the light layer. Often what you will look good is a uniform light layer that does not have big blocks of white. And the other thing that you wanted to consider is your impression will get better as you go along. So if your first one isn't great, please don't worry about it. Okay, so here is what I call the detailed impression. It's the impression that the stencil made in the ink and was left behind the stencil. If you have brand new stencils and ferns and leaves and twigs, it may take several impressions for you to get an ink buildup on the back of your stencil to actually see a nice, strong, detailed impression. So again, don't worry if it doesn't happen right away. If you pick a stencil, I suggest making at least 5 impressions of it before you give up, because it takes a little bit of time for you to get your ink just right. Here I've laid a layer of ink down, and I've left a couple of white openings so that the light layer will show through. Burnish, sneak a peek, roll it back down, burnish again, all the time trying not to make fingerprints. So I like how I left those two rectangular shapes. Here what I'm doing is a newsprint pickup. See that ink that's on the newsprint? That was all plate ink, and it probably doesn't look visible to you when you're printing. And again, I'm going to show you again. See, it looked like there was no ink left on the background behind the stencil, but there was. So what I do is do a newsprint pickup, like 2, 3, 4, so that it will make the detailed impression more distinct. And this is something that you can choose to do or not to do. Do it with some prints and not others. Here I thought, oh, maybe if I leave that black mark up at the top, it'll be interesting. So I reframed the detailed impression and choosing this smooth gold layer. And because I moved the framing mat, the plate ink is a little bit different, and it makes a distinct straight edge line over there on the left side, well, now the right side, see by my thumb. And I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to even out that very light layer of ink that's left on the plate and do what I call a spot pickup. I'm going to put the framing mat back down, then I'll put my print lined up with the framing mat and just burnish in that area where I want to pick up a little bit of plate ink. And it works to make the that hard horizontal line blend a little bit more. So if you think it, try it, and embrace learning experiences. So what I was showing you there was the difference between the plate ink. The blue-black one was all had plate ink on it, and the other one I did a lot of newsprint pickups to get rid of most of the plate ink, so then the gold showed through. Here I'm using a black shape, again putting my stencil down, and I'm doing several impressions of this fern to give my ink a chance to get to be just right, to build up on the back of the stencil. Um, and I'm picking a background print that is multicolored and textured. Sometimes for these background prints, I will pick something that I just don't like, and the black will cover most of it up, and it has a new life. Do I like it? Maybe, maybe not. Um, Plate ink, so I'm going to do some newsprint pickups. Here, I'll do it with a piece of white print paper so you can see how much plate ink is left. Quite a bit. Lots of newsprint pickups, and you're going to go through a lot of newsprint, so you can actually probably reuse the newsprint like a day later or so. My stencil is old and fragile, but I still love it. I do set it on the plate, ink side up, and that seems to keep everything a little bit clean. So I'm looking through my pile of prints, trying to decide. I love how I positioned this impression way off to one side and the fern like arching into the open space. Here I'm choosing a gold layer that was a little bit blotchy. Laying down my print burnish. Really make sure you burnish in the edges of the print. And I really love how this one came out. I love how the plating filled in some of the white areas. There is a very light impression on there. It's so light though, it's probably not going to be distinct enough to stand up to one of your layered prints, but you could print it off on a white piece of paper and maybe it'll become a foundation for a future print. Now I'm going to switch stencils to a very small fern. The last fern was bigger than my paper. It filled the page. So what I was doing right there was trying to open the little leaflets and get the fern to have a more interesting negative space. The negative space is the shape around things. So what I did here was use a shape of black ink in the center of the print to define or to make another shape within the print. And what this does is it allows some of the background ink to show around the edges and to have that shaped impression right in the middle. I'm not a big fan of tiny stencils in my prints, but sometimes it works and some folks like it, so I wanted to try it here for you. Did many newsprint pickups, got a nice detailed impression, centered it on a print that I think had a lot of interesting textures, interesting shapes created by the light impression. Here I have what I would call is a maple leaf, not hugely interesting in its shape. It does fill the page. I've laid down ink to cover the whole section of the print, and it's okay. I don't love it. Maybe if it was more colorful, it would be better. But I think for me, it's the shape of the leaf that is not interesting to me. It's not a super dark, detailed impression, so I'm putting it on a pretty light and pretty even first layered impression. And that one is definitely more interesting than the plain shape. Here, I've speeded up the inking process a lot so that you guys will be able to get us to see me pull a lot more prints. Here I have a very deteriorated fern that I found in the woods. And it's something that I happen to love. It's very delicate, but still strong enough to make really interesting impressions. So that was a very bright background, and it even showed through the dark layer. So that was kind of interesting. Peel up my stencil after several newsprint pickups, and I'm trying to decide which side do I want the white on. And I decide that I want the orange on the left and the fern arching into the white, or leading the eye into the white of the lower layer. And I'm pretty happy with how these marks combine to complete. And you notice how that plating just kind of fills in the white space just enough to create some harmony. So here I'm doing a pick up, a print of what was left on the plate. who knows, those may become a foundation for another print. Now here I'm cleaning up the plate by spritzing it and wiping it with a rag so that on the next impression I can use the shape of my dark layer as part of the design, as we did with the light layers and I've been doing with some of the darker layers. So I had to get rid of all the inked areas that I didn't want. So when I'm placing this, I'm thinking, where do I want the viewer's eye to go? How do I want to place this fern on here? It does not always have to be straight up and down. I try not to lead the viewer straight off the page, so I want to kind of them to circle around the page. I've left a couple of white areas, and I've got a pretty even light impression here. So remember, this is the first impression, the shaped impression, which is mostly black, and it covers up most of the first base layer. I think it's interesting because the shape of my stencil is interesting. Tons of newsprint pickups to get rid of all that plate ink. Peel up my stencil, set it to the side, and put it ink side up to kind of control the mess. And then frame up my detailed impression. Trying to keep my fingers clean, and I've got a light layer that's mostly gold, but has some brayer marks in it, and burnish. And again, this one I quite love. I love the combination of this gold and black and blue. So the light layer creates enough interest, and the detailed impression creates a focus. So I love that combination. Here I want to play with picking up the leftover ink. I've reformatted or repositioned my framing mat, so I've got some black edges. And you can do that several times if you want. Okay, so here, let's switch over to a new found object stencil. I've got a feather, a strip of blue, going on top of a strip of orange and yellow, with plenty of white left on the side. Burnish, sneak a peek, peel it up. And I like where this is going. I might be able to add a couple of stamped marks to call it complete. Newsprint pickups. Peel up my stencil, set it to the side, and get a new light colored print. So the detailed impression will probably be strongest on very light impressions. I like how the space is divided up there. I've got some leftover ink, so I'm taking a fresh piece of paper and just picking up that impression. I find it pretty hard to just cover up delicate, beautiful impressions if there's some way that I could use them. Right there, I'm trying to play with creating a more interesting feather arrangement. I'm trying to adjust the negative spaces. And our final found object stencil of my final one is the threads. So I've combined the threads in the feather in this print. And burnish, sneak a peek. I've got a light layer with some darks and unevenness. I like the color combination. It might need some stamped marks to call it complete. So just like when we first did our light layers, we may end up with some completed prints. We may end up with some prints that need a few more marks to call them complete. This one, I think the detailed impression is too light, and the light impression is too dark, so there's no clear focus. So here we'll play with it again. Remember, I told you to play with your stencil at least for, if I want to say 5 impressions, so that you can play with the negative space, play with the position. I love the color combo in that one. I like the bright and the dark. And again, a couple of stamped marks might complete that. Lots of newsprint pickups. Set my stencil to the side. I've got a gold and orange, and I'm going to put that detailed impression. You should be noticing that your detailed impressions get stronger the longer you use your stencil. So they should be getting stronger and darker. Now let's just play with some thread. You could play with threads for days alone. You could tie knots in them. You could play with thick yarn and thin yarn, and the fibers of the yarns can get picked up in your detailed and your shaped impressions. Just remember that when you put down a layer of black or dark, it's going to cover up mostly everything except where your stencil is. So you may have noticed that in the last impression that barely anything showed through. But what is beautiful about the threads is the detailed impression. If you do several newsprint pickups, you can get these lovely, lovely lines that can weave through your prints and connect to elements. So as you play with using threads and yarns, you may want to keep that in mind as maybe adding a connective element to a subsequent print at a later date, or you can add threads right at this stage by connecting elements with a thread running across it or through it. And when I say connect, I don't mean straight line connect. I mean a visual linking of elements to make the print a little more cohesive. And one of the tricks when you are trying to use these threads as line elements is to do a lot of newsprint pickups so that you get rid of all that plating and it looks like a line. Now here's a wonderful print where I had done the ghost impression of the detail, which is the very light one, and then added a darker one on top. All right, enjoy. I hope you have some fun with this.